that I've told you a little bit about what's going to be required of you for this class, I want to say a little bit more about the nature of the course itself. This is social ethics. It is an ethics class, but it's listed as a philosophy class. And many of you may not know exactly what philosophy is. I really didn't have much knowledge of that prior to entering college. I had heard the word philosophy a handful of times. Truthfully, my only acquaintance with philosophy was from the movie Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. And so when I got to college, I was like, you take classes in this? This is a thing? I had no idea. Certainly didn't know you could earn a degree in it. But ethics is a particular discipline within the broader heading of philosophy, much like in science. You could take a class in chemistry or biology or physics. Philosophy, there are many, many subfields within philosophy. There's ethics, logic, philosophy of religion, and various other kinds as well, epistemology, metaphysics. And philosophy is a word that's used in a wide variety of contexts, but as an academic discipline, it goes all the way back to ancient Greece. It goes all the way back to a handful of guys, a couple of whom you've probably heard of, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. These were juggernauts in their day. They were towers of learning and scholarship, and they are credited with being some of the earliest philosophers in ancient Greece. And we're talking around 400 BC. That's Socrates died in 399 BC. So it would be a little bit before then when Socrates really began. He was the first amongst these three mentioned. And right here what we have is we actually have a painting that was done about 2,000 years later by the Italian Renaissance painter Raphael. And this is the center of it, and the much larger painting has a lot more people in it. And right here in the center, it's we have represented on the left the guy pointing his finger into the heavens. This guy right here, this is supposed to be Aristotle, and right here, this is supposed to be Plato. And this painting was called the School of Athens because where these ancient philosophers lived was in Athens, Greece. And so what Raphael did when he painted this is he was trying to represent this ancient learning that had taken place and show a whole number of different important figures from ancient Greece, because this was really considered the high point of classical learning with these handful of philosophers and mathematicians and other people of notable scholarship. Well, this is where philosophy began as an academic discipline, and what I want to try to do is explain exactly what philosophy is. And the way I'm going to do that is by first beginning and trying to tell you what philosophy isn't, because the truth is there's a whole lot of confusion about what philosophy is, and you'll hear people, they'll confuse it with a number of different other disciplines. And I can understand to some extent why that is, because philosophy does discuss other disciplines. Like in philosophy, we might talk about historical figures or literary figures. In philosophy, we talk about religion, we talk about science, we talk about a whole lot of different things. But philosophy really is truly distinct from all of these other things. Philosophy is not a literature class, and it's not a history class, even though, like I said, we talk about historical and we talk about literary figures. Philosophy is also not a psychology course. I think people sometimes get philosophy and psychology confused, and I think there's a superficial reason why that is, which is they both start with the letter P. But more seriously, I think the reason is because in both psychology and philosophy, we'll talk about reasons that people believe things. But we're talking about different kinds of questions when we talk about reasons for belief in a psychology class and in a philosophy class. In a psychology class, you might say, what's the reason John did that? Or what's the reason John believes that? And what you're asking for is some kind of historical causal story. What led him to this point? What happened in John's past? Was his father absent? Did his mother not show love to him? Is that why he thinks poorly of women now, for instance? When you're talking in psychology terms, you're basically, when you're asking what's the reason someone believes something or they do something, you're asking about that person's past and what led them to this particular belief or moment in their life. In a philosophy class, we ask something very, very different. We do talk about reasons for beliefs. I'm going to say, what's the reason you believe that? But in a philosophy class, what I'm asking is, do you have good evidence? Is there good reason or good evidence for you to think that? Is there evidence that would convince or persuade me to agree? So you see, it's not. I'm not at all concerned in a philosophy class about what happened in your past. Maybe something tragic or something good even could have happened in your past. What I'm asking instead is not what happened in your past that led you to this, but really, do you have good reasons? Do you have good evidence to think what you're thinking? We'll skip down a couple points here, but philosophy is not a self-help course. I think a lot of people get confused by this, and they think, oh, philosophy, you go in and it's going to make you feel better about yourself and the world. And maybe part of the confusions for this, I blame it on a lot of popular bookstores that just lump together every a hodgepodge of different imaginable topics under the section heading philosophy. So you'll see Aristotle next to people who write books on meditation or something like that. But philosophy is not something that's going to be used as any kind of self-help course. Rather, philosophy, actually, if anything, it'll probably make you more upset and miserable in your life because it's going to challenge your beliefs and it's going to ask you to evaluate them and to see if the things you believe are comfortable or you hold them just because they're comfortable, or if you hold the beliefs that you have for good reason, yes or no. This is also not a science class, even though we do discuss science and we do talk about the implications of science quite often. We're not doing the same thing scientists do. We do look for truth, we do look for evidence, but we have different methods than what scientists have. Finally, philosophy is not just a collection of sayings. A lot of people think of philosophy as, I don't know, the philosopher is this guy, this monk who lives on top of a mountain, and you have to, go find this sacred flower and travel for days up to the mountaintop and hand it to the philosopher. And then once you give it to him, he says something cryptic like, the obstacle is the path, and you just leave wondering, what the hell was that guy talking about? But philosophy is not just a collection of sayings either. In philosophy, we're not just trying to come up with clever little sayings just to capture some little nugget of truth. We're doing something very, very different. Well, what is it that we are doing? Well, that's a really good question. And the truth is, if you were to ask different philosophers what philosophy is, you're liable to be met with different answers. But what I've tried to do is boil philosophy down to a handful of key characteristics. And one broad thing we can say about philosophy is that, and I think everybody would agree, is that what it involves is what we could say is the systematic examination of questions most central to human existence. So philosophers, we're going to look at this set of questions. What's the meaning of life? Or does God exist? Or questions of ethics? Or other kinds of questions. And we're going to systematically, that means go through step by step and evaluate and examine these questions, the responses to these questions, the evidence for or against the various responses, and just try to evaluate and find out which answer to these questions is the most plausible or the most reasonable. And in doing this, philosophy, I think, can be characterized along several dimensions. And one thing that really distinguishes philosophy from other disciplines is the methods that we employ in philosophy. Earlier I was contrasting philosophy with science. And in science, what you use are what are called empirical methods. Empirical means something you can see or touch or taste or observe with your senses. So a scientist, if they're trying to figure out a particular question, like what caused the disease to spread in this region, what they're going to do is they're going to form a hypothesis. They're basically going to apply the scientific method. They're going to look for things they can see and taste and touch to give an explanation. In philosophy, what we do is this is going to sound really unsophisticated, but we more or less just think about things. We ask questions, we evaluate positions. We try to get clear on the terminology people are using. We weigh the pros and cons for the various positions that are offered. And we just, I heard a philosopher once say that if you boil philosophy down to what it truly is, it's really just hard thinking about particular questions. And I think there's a lot to that. Now that's kind of a rough and ready explanation of the methods we use, and what we're actually going to be doing in the first 2 weeks is I'm going to be discussing methods of philosophy in a bit more detail, because there are things that we do in particular, but at a high altitude level, I mean, what we do is we stop and we reflect and we think about the various answers for or against different positions that people take. Something else that distinguishes philosophy is, you might say, that there is no central authority to dictate answers on the questions we look at. In science, if you have a question of scientific nature, you might just go ask a scientist, like, "Hey, Mr. Scientist, what is the speed of light?" And then the scientist can say, "Oh, we've performed some studies, and the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second squared." And then you just go to the scientist and you consult them, and they provide you the answer. But in philosophy, it doesn't work that way. Even I have a PhD. I'm not an authority on answering these kinds of questions. The reality is that everybody is their own authority when it comes to answering the questions of philosophy. What I can provide and what we can do is we can look at the reasons that you have, the reasons that you offer for the various views that you want to adopt. But there's no one who's any more special than anyone else who can just say once and for all, here's the right answer. And you can think about this for a second. Like, take a paradigmatic philosophical question, something like, is abortion morally wrong? I mean, that's not something you can come and you can say, "Hey, Jesse, I was wondering, what do you think? You have a PhD in philosophy. Is abortion morally wrong?" And if I said to you, "No, I don't think it is. It's okay sometimes," you say, "Okay, well, thanks. I've always wondered that. I've always had a question about it. Glad you answered it." I mean, that doesn't make any sense. I'm not the kind of, there's nothing special about me that could settle a question like that. So in philosophy, there's really not an authority the way that you have in other disciplines. And then finally, I'd say one thing that distinguishes philosophy is the aim of philosophy. And what philosophers aim at is truth and reasonable belief. Anybody could maybe look at the kinds of questions I was indicating a second ago, questions about the existence of life, the meaning of life or the existence of God, and maybe they could even apply the methods of philosophers. But that doesn't mean they're really engaged in philosophy, because what sets philosophers apart is that we're not just interested in winning arguments or persuading people or coercing people or convincing people. We really are concerned with, or we're supposed to be concerned with, truth. And you can think about the role of a philosopher in this particular aim and contrast it with maybe someone who is like a stereotype, sleazy courtroom lawyer. You've probably seen these shows where you have this sleazy courtroom lawyer who says things like, "I don't care if my client is guilty or innocent. I'm just going to win my case." All right? Or you've probably been in an argument with someone before, and you could tell that they didn't really care, what was true and what was false. They just want it to be right no matter what. And that's not the spirit of the philosopher. We're really concerned with understanding the world as it is, with getting at truth and getting at what seems to be the most reasonable set of beliefs to hold. So if you ask me what philosophy is, again, I'm going to say that it's distinguished by the subject matter, the particular kinds of questions that we ask, the way we approach these, and the kind of conceptual methods we use. We're going to also be distinct from maybe if you would approach these kinds of questions from a religious point of view, where you do have an authority. In philosophy, the authority rests within each individual. And then also the aim at philosophy, which is that we aim at truth and reasonable opinion, and not just with being right. Now, it's a good question that you should ask yourself at this point, which is, why in the world study philosophy at all? I mean, why in the world take a class in philosophy beyond the fact that you have to? Why take a class? Why is it worth spending your money and your time on it? And the truth is, if you're asking that question, then that's a really good philosophical question. Thank you for asking it. And I'm going to try to answer that question by saying just this, is that I think the biggest value, or there are lots of values of philosophy that it holds. On the one hand, I think questions of philosophy, people do find them in many cases just to be naturally interesting. And one thing we could say about this, Aristotle said this. He said that all men by nature desire to know. And I think Aristotle got on something that's right. I think most human beings, we find that there are just certain questions that interest us and intrigue us. And many of those are philosophical in nature. So why take a philosophy class? Well, because you're a rational being. And by your very nature, there are probably many things that you find intriguing and you want to know. Now, are you going to be interested in everything we talk about in this class? No, I doubt it. But I imagine there are going to be some questions you do find interesting, and you want to know them and understand them better, not because it's going to necessarily make you better at your job, or not because it's going to, earn you money necessarily, but just that's an interesting question. I just want to know it. Maybe that question for you is a question about abortion. Maybe you find the topic of abortion interesting, or maybe for you it's a question of physician-assisted suicide, or maybe for you questions you find interesting are questions about whether or not God exists. These are distinct philosophical questions, and like I said, I think that people do find them just naturally and intrinsically interesting. Secondly, I would also say about philosophy that it's important to study because, to some extent, the questions of philosophy are inescapable. At the end of the day, you are going to make assumptions and take philosophical positions on various questions, whether you like it or not. You are going to make an assumption or take a position on abortion, or you're going to take a position on the existence of God. Even if you choose, you say, I'm not going to make a choice. Well, then you've chosen a position. You've adopted a form of agnosticism. So you're going to take a position on philosophical questions, whether you like it or not. And so the reality is you're not confronted with a choice, will I engage in philosophy or won't I? But really, your choice is going to be, will I do it well or will I do it poorly? That's really the only choice before you. And taking a class like this can help sharpen a lot of your mental thinking and your critical thinking abilities, and answer these kinds of questions that you're naturally going to take positions on in a more effective and more comprehensive fashion. But finally, I think there is also sort of practical value to studying a class in philosophy. And the practical value, it's not something that is going to be maybe directly translatable into your skill set for your job, but it will be the kind of thing that has, I think, indirect payoff for you for anything that you want to do in life, or anything that involves any kind of critical thinking abilities. Because what you're going to see is that as we roll along throughout the semester, we're going to adopt a systematic approach to answering a lot of these questions that's very similar and transferable to a lot of other kinds of ways that you might systematically approach questions and try to answer them for many, many other tasks that you might perform. I list up here some ways in which I think studying questions of philosophy can help you. They can help you, think outside the box a little bit more, or maybe make you more open-minded. In philosophy, we do place a premium on the ability to express ourselves clearly and accurately, especially in writing, and I do think studying philosophy can help you with that. Now, you could take my word for it and just say, hey, philosophy, it's going to help train me in these various ways. You could take my word for it, but I wouldn't be a good philosopher if I was asking you to take my word for it. So I'm going to try to provide you some sort of evidence that philosophy does have this kind of payoff. And one means of providing this is by looking at how philosophers do when they take standardized tests. And I don't know if any of you have ever considered or ever heard of this test called the GRE, but if you want to go to graduate school and earn a master's degree or a PhD, you may be required to take a standardized test called the GRE, which is the Graduate Record Examination. And it is a lot like the SAT on steroids. And once you get done taking the test, they ask everybody what their major was. And it turns out that year after year after year, that philosophy majors do extremely well on the verbal reasoning section. In fact, we outperform pretty much every single major. And, some years we might come in second, but most years I think we come in first, even ahead of English majors and literature majors. And that's not because people who study philosophy are necessarily smarter, but it's just because the way philosophy trains you to read passages and to answer questions and to express yourself, it helps you really do well on these kinds of verbal tests. Same thing for the written portion. For the GRE, there's also a written portion to this exam, and philosophy majors tend to do extremely well on this. And again, that's because we work so hard to write clearly and precisely, and we really help sharpen that kind of skill. We don't do as well on the math section, but we don't fare too poorly. When you study philosophy, you end up not taking a lot of math. This chart up here is actually a little imprecise because I don't know why it doesn't include math majors and engineers, because they always do better than we do as well. But philosophy majors, we do okay on math. I'm not going to lie to you. I don't think philosophy is going to help you with math, but it will help you with your verbal reasoning skills. There's another standardized test you could take called the LSAT, and this is the test that you would take if you were to go to law school. And this test also, again, like the GRE, asks you what your major was, and ask you, and then it determines how people perform based on what their major was. And it turns out, yet again here, philosophy majors almost always outperform other majors. We do extremely well on the LSAT. So, and the reason for this is not because philosophy majors are smarter than anybody else. It's just because of the way it trains you to think about various questions, and the way it challenges you to probe questions. It makes it so that people do really well on tests like the LSAT also. Finally, there's a test if you wanted to go to business school, get your MBA. You might say, hey, look, Jesse, I don't want to go to graduate school. I don't want to go to law school. I want to go in the world of business. I want to be cashing checks and snapping necks after all. How's philosophy going to help me with that? Well, it turns out that if you want to be that guy, you want to be the baller, earning all the Skrilla, then philosophy might be the major for you also. Why? Well, because philosophy majors do really, really well in this test called the GMAT, which is a test you'd have to take if you wanted to go to business school and earn your MBA. And that might seem kind of counterintuitive, because you might say, well, how in the world is philosophy going to make you a better business manager? How in the world is philosophy going to help you in that way? And the way it's going to help you is that the truth is that philosophy majors just do really, really well in the world of business and finance. And as it turns out, in the last handful of years, there have been a number of articles that have been in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, talking about how philosophy majors fare really well in the world of business. And in fact, there have been a number of people who have studied philosophy and gone on to significant success in the world of business and finance, and they attribute a lot of their success to their philosophy backgrounds. Because the reality is I think, and I should have included this up here, but the founder of LinkedIn, he studied philosophy, and he said that coming up with a philosophical argument and writing a business plan are basically the exact same kind of skills are used in each case. And so philosophy does help you in these ways also. And I know you're thinking, well, look, I'm never going to major in philosophy, and you're probably right, you're not. But even studying philosophy a little bit can help sharpen your tools and help make you a better writer and better communicator and better thinker overall. And in addition to people who have gone on to have success in business, there are a number of other people who've studied philosophy and gone on to see great success later in life. And they attribute their study of philosophy to their success, at least in part. They said studying philosophy really helped make them better thinkers and better people overall. And so I'm saying all this because even though you might be thinking, again, that you're not going to study philosophy full time, you're just going to take this one class. I do think that there are some real big practical benefits that can be had from even taking one course in philosophy. I think of philosophy as kind of like lifting weights in a way. It's not something, let's say you're a football player, there's not going to be a time in a football game where someone asks you to bench press 200 pounds, but lifting weights makes you stronger, makes you faster, and makes you better able to perform when you're actually in the game. And philosophy is kind of the same way. The skills that you learn, the techniques you learn, they stick with you, and you can apply them in various other formats as well. Now, in this class, what we're going to do, this is an ethics class, which is a very specific kind of philosophy class, and we're going to cover a lot of different issues. This class, we're going to be looking at some particular ethical issues with a philosophical lens. We're going to start off the semester, once we get done talking about some preliminary things, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the nature of ethics and various ethical theories. In doing this, we're going to talk about various theories of punishment. We're also going to spend some time talking about our ethical duties to help those in need, those suffering in third world conditions. We're going to talk about abortion, and the ethics involved in that. And then we're going to round off the semester talking about physician-assisted suicide and the ethics of that as well. Now, I know there are no actual official prerequisites for the class listed, but I do have some kind of unofficial ones that I was just going to throw out at you, and I mean these only kind of tongue-in-cheek. But this is a class in which I'm going to, and you're going to have your beliefs challenged about some things that you might already have well-established opinions on. And it's really important that you begin the semester at least with the thought that maybe some of your beliefs might be wrong. Maybe you don't know everything already. Maybe there are ways in which your beliefs can be improved. I know I said this class wasn't, or philosophy isn't, just a series of quotes, but I do like this quote right here from Confucius. And Confucius said, "I never taught anyone who wasn't willing to learn." And what he means here is you as a student, you have to be a willing learner. You have to think that there is something new that you can learn, that you don't have everything figured out. Because the moment you think you have everything figured out, you're going to quit trying, you're going to quit listening, you're going to quit exploring. And so it's really important that you do begin the semester with an open mind. In addition to this, it's really important that you do try to take an interest in the topics we're going to be looking at. If you approach everything we do as just a burden, as an obligation, you're really not going to get the most out of it, and it's going to be a painful semester for you. So try hard to find something that you do find interesting within the topics. Try to see if you can't find a way that the things we discuss connect up with your life in various ways. Because if you really do set your heart on learning and take an interest in the topics, you're just going to gain much, much more from them than, again, if you look at it as something that you have to do.